Wherever you're listening in the world, thank you for tuning into this special episode of IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, and in light of the brutal attack on Israel on Shabbat, Shmini Atzeret, October 7th, 2023, we've invited Jonathan Schanzer back to the program to provide perspective. Jonathan is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD, where he oversees the work of the organization's experts and scholars. He's also on the leadership team of FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power. Previously, Jonathan worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He's held previous think tank research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum. Jonathan's a prolific speaker, has penned countless articles, and has written 4 important books on the region, including Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. With that, we welcome you back, Jonathan, to the program. And indeed, I'm sorry, it's under these circumstances.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Good to be with you.
Well, we are recording this on Sunday morning, New York time, October 8th. It's a fast-changing situation in Israel. Give us the lay of the land, Jonathan, your thoughts.
Obviously, this has been a fast-changing situation, very fluid. It's been difficult to get all the information in real time, a lot of it because the Israelis have not been entirely forthcoming, or maybe they didn't even know the full picture as it was occurring yesterday. I think the long and short of it is that the Israelis were taken by surprise. Hamas, with the help of Iran, launched a devastating attack yesterday. They appeared to have breached the barrier alongside the Gaza Strip in multiple places. They attacked multiple military installations. They penetrated the barrier through explosives and through heavy work vehicles. They were able to enable hundreds of Hamas operatives to stream across the border with motorcycles, ATVs, and even by foot. From there, it appears that Hamas militants engaged directly with the IDF, resulting in multiple casualties, multiple hostages, and multiple dead. From there, it appears that Hamas went into many of the towns and villages along what's known as the Gaza envelope. From there, they captured many more hostages, killed many more Israelis. Right now, the number of hostages appears to stand at something in the range of 170, which is an astronomical number from Israel's perspective. There appear to be more than 600 dead, thousands wounded. Many of those wounded have been reported to be in critical condition. So this is really a horrible day for Israel. The intelligence failure here, I think, is a huge component of what's going on, but so is the fingerprints of Iran, right? And I think, just to be very clear here, the Israelis got it wrong. They believed that Hamas was content with the status quo for quite some time. I actually spoke to Israeli officials just last week who indicated that the Hamas leadership in Gaza was looking for a modus vivendi with Israel, just a means of maintaining, I don't want to say good relations, but maintaining the status quo that would enable Hamas to govern in the Gaza Strip, a population in Gaza that was growing restless with the political situation, with the economic situation. And here we see this just a week later. It's clearly a breakdown of intelligence. And I suspect there will be some kind of commission that looks into this at some point soon. And then there's the big question of, what did Iran do to help? I mean, we saw paragliders yesterday. There have been reports of a possible cyber intrusion in Israel that might have enabled all of this. A lot of what we saw yesterday was way too coordinated for Hamas to do on its own. Remember, Hamas has been largely seen as a tactical threat to Israel. You know, we're looking at crude rockets and, suicide bombings, not anything of the scale that we saw yesterday. So the fact that this has happened the way that it has raises a lot of questions. Israel is obviously still learning what happened. They're still trying to equalize the situation. It's very fluid, but suffice it to say, this is the worst attack on Israel that I have seen in the 51 years that I've been alive.
So there's a lot to unpack there, Jonathan. Obviously, can you talk a little bit more about Iran briefly, although we could have a whole separate conversation, certainly on Iran's involvement in the region, in this whole notion of a ring of fire, which I know one of your colleagues has written about and talked about. And if you can put that into context for our listeners.
Sure. Look, the first thing to note here is that Hamas receives a huge amount of funding, training, weaponry, instruction, technology from the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is part of a proxy strategy that Iran has deployed around Israel since the 1980s. Right? We saw the founding of the Islamic Jihad in 1981, the founding of Hezbollah in 83, 84, Hamas in 1988. In other words, what Iran has done is it has tried to fight Israel to the last Palestinian and Lebanese. Doing this by proxy has enabled the regime to stay safe at home while it continues to up the pressure around Israel. That strategy that you mentioned, that ring of fire, that is a term that is often wielded by my colleague, Mark Dubowitz, FDD CEO. And it really refers to this idea of a strategy of strangulation, right, of encircling Israel with these proxy groups that are armed to the teeth and willing to wage war against Israel with regularity. It has ensured that Israel has seen no rest for years, even as it has grown stronger, even as it has sued for peace with some of its enemies like Jordan and Egypt. The Gaza Strip has remained a hostile place. The West Bank has remained hostile. Lebanon has remained hostile. We even see Shiite militias closely aligned with Iran operating in places like war-torn Syria. All of this has made Israel a target, a regular target. And so this is, I think, the important context to understand here is that this was not sort of a one-off war of a Palestinian group against Israel. This is part of a long-standing strategy that Iran has deployed using proxy forces, some of whom are Palestinian, some of whom are Lebanese, to wage an asymmetric war against the Jewish state.
And then can you talk about the nexus between the United States and Iran, especially vis-a-vis this $6 billion that was just paid, and whether or not some of that money did in fact go to fund either this or will go to fund future terrorist activities? And even beyond the money, just the whole look and the appearance of that nexus.
Right. And I think, look, the larger context here is that as Iran has pursued its illicit nuclear program and has enriched to dangerous levels, the uranium enrichment program that it has, the weaponization program that we believe it continues to pursue, and that has been exposed by Israel through a daring raid that it conducted in Tehran at a warehouse in 2018. We have this component of what's going on in Iran, which has been I think the driving force behind the U.S. efforts to establish some kind of a diplomatic arrangement with the Islamic Republic. The Israelis have been steadfastly opposed to this from the get-go. The idea of providing sanctions relief or other benefits to a regime that is engaging in this kind of illegal and dangerous activity, really with the goal of the destruction of Israel in mind at all times. I think this has been very clear. So the Israelis have been really concerned about this. Obviously, that all came to a screeching halt in 2018 during the Trump administration. Trump pulled out of what was known as the JCPOA, a deal that President Barack Obama had entered into with the Islamic Republic. That initial agreement yielded Iran somewhere in the vicinity of $150 billion in sanctions relief, cash, and other financial perks. Then we saw, the return of maximum pressure, as we would call it, sanctions, and other means of isolating the Islamic Republic. This all came during the Trump years. And then with the Biden administration's return, we saw an effort to try to get back into the deal. The most recent iteration of a kind of a deal between the United States and Iran came in the form of a prisoner swap. I prefer to actually call it hostage diplomacy. The Iranians have been holding, I think more than five, but five hostages were ultimately released in this most recent deal. In exchange, the United States provided $6 billion, as well as releasing a number of other Iranians that were being held in America for crimes that they were convicted of. So now the question becomes, did any of those $6 billion, did that go to benefit Iran? Did Iran convey some of that money to Hamas to support the operations? The U.S. government says that that did not happen, that the money has yet to be released, that it is sitting in Doha, Qatar. But let me just point out something that is just incredibly awkward, but does need to be said, is that the Qataris are patrons of Hamas, and they are sometimes even aligned with Iran. I don't want to call them allies, but they work closely with Iran. They share a gas field, which they draw the resources that they are able to convert into dollars. So this is an extremely awkward, almost impossible situation that the U.S. has put itself in. Again, we're hearing that the U.S. has ensured that none of those funds have been released, but I think we can say with certainty that, Iran is banking on some of that money to be able to supply additional cash to its proxies, and that would include Hamas, Hezbollah, as well as some of the others that may get involved in future conflagrations with Israel.
As we also look at the regional picture, let's bring in Saudi Arabia into the conversation. And Jonathan, this was all unfolding, there was something that I was thinking about that I wanted to share with you, and I want you to respond to, because obviously the United States and Israel has been making those overtures to Saudi Arabia to establish full diplomatic ties with Israel. And one of the things that I was thinking about was, is Saudi Arabia looking at this now and saying to the Palestinians, Palestinians, we had your back. We were negotiating on your behalf. Now you've done this. And as my late father would say, goodbye and good luck. We're going ahead and we're going to be establishing diplomatic ties with Israel. We're going to wash our hands of your situation. And because they're looking at this nexus again between Hamas and Iran and saying, you know what, we don't want to have anything to do with that. Our benefits to having relations with Israel are far greater than our benefits to having relations with the Palestinians. Or is it a case that the Saudis are saying we have such a conservative society, to win over elements within our own Saudi populace, we still need to sort of maintain the banner and sort of fly that banner of the Palestinian cause? And I'm wondering if you can weigh in on that.
Yeah, look, without getting too Talmudic here, the Saudis issued a couple of statements yesterday, and they were, iterative. I think initially they seemed very aloof as it related to Israel, and we saw maybe a little bit of a warming over the course of the day. But I think that there are two things that I look at right now as it relates to the Saudis. I think the Saudis certainly have been mulling their options as it relates to Israel. And I think as of, the day before yesterday, things seem to be moving in a very positive direction. The attack from Gaza, the potential hand of Iran, all of this, I think, has thrown some of what has been going on into doubt. And let me explain. I think there's two elements to watch specifically. One is Israel's strength. There's a reason why the Arab world has gravitated to Israel, and that is because Israel has been able to conduct military operations, cyber operations, psychological operations, attacks against the Iranian military directly, attacks against Iranian proxies in Syria, for example. There's been a campaign that's been going on. The Israelis call it the campaign between wars. You can call it a gray zone warfare. Whatever you want to call it, the Israelis have been eating Iran's lunch. And this has absolutely encouraged the Arab world to slowly align themselves with Israel. They say to themselves, okay, if Iran is our ultimate threat and perhaps our ultimate enemy in the region, we need powerful friends to be able to counter the activities of the Islamic Republic. And so Israel was doing that. Yesterday showed that Israel has a soft underbelly of sorts. It showed some Israeli weakness. And this, I think, may have thrown some of Saudi Arabia's calculus into doubt. Now, if Israel, and I suspect that Israel will regain its footing and it will begin to show its military prowess on the battlefield against Hamas or against others that may test Israel's resolve. And that, I think, should be able to claw back some of what was lost in terms of Israel being taken by surprise, Israel looking weaker. Got to remember, in the Middle East, weakness does not buy you much. And so this is, I think, going to be a challenge for Israel. It's not just that they need to regain their footing for the security of their own people, but there's a lot more at stake. The future of the region, one could argue, is also at stake here. And I think Israel is keenly aware of that. So is the United States, as it has tried to broker this agreement. So that's one. But at the same time, while Israel needs to project that strength, there is also a kind of the flip side of this, which is, there will undoubtedly, there already have been reprisals that Israel has launched against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Israel's going to need to be careful about, shedding innocent blood. Of course, Israel always has to be careful of this, that you don't want to see collateral damage and civilian casualties, things like this. But the longer and the more horrific the photos and the video might be, the more difficult it will be for Saudi Arabia to convince its population that this is an ally that they should, seek out. And so Israel is in this, I think, an impossible position where it needs to project strength, but not too much strength, but yet enough strength. This is, I think, the conundrum that Israel is going to find itself in. I actually believe that while Israel certainly is going to try to, get back its citizens that are, being held right now, unbelievable that many of these are civilians, women, children. I've seen horrific videos of children and elderly that are being held by Hamas. I mean, these are war crimes without question. They will need to try to get them back. There's no question about it. But then I think there's the broader question of the strategy, which is who should pay the ultimate price. I think that Iran, if Israel turns its sights on Iran and really begins to exact retribution in that way, that may be the way to project strength while also messaging to the Gulf Arab states and possible peace partners that Israel is still the ally that they should seek out.
And so we're going to talk about sort of what you're looking for next in just a few minutes. But if we just wind down that chapter in terms of Saudi Arabia, do you have any thoughts about where those talks might go right now, or should we really just watch how things unfold?
I think that this is all on the back burner right now. I mean, I'm sure the Israelis would love nothing more than to, continue to work toward peace. But, people are calling this Israel's 9/11. People are saying that this is Israel's Pearl Harbor. I don't know what the apt analog is here for Israel to things that have happened here in the United States, but this was an intelligence breakdown, a loss of significant proportion, a revelation of Israeli weakness that I don't think anybody had ever expected to see. So they need to regain their footing, and they need to fight back first, I think, before they start talking about peace or normalization with some of these countries in the region.
Jonathan, this was such a brutal attack. This just wasn't sort of like one drone doing some damage and then calling it a day. And, I'm trying to grapple with a question for you about this brutality and what it shows Hamas is all about and what they want. And, I've seen people post on social media saying, when they're showing a photo of a grandmother holding a rifle and the victory sign, that she's forced to actually pose and do. And the caption, of course, is these people want a state. And so can you talk about that? Can you talk about what it shows the true intentions of Hamas are and the international response to that for those that were very supportive of the plight of those in Gaza? Can you address that?
Sure. I mean, look, a really instructive document to look back on if folks are inclined is the Hamas Charter of 1988. It is an amalgam of hyper-nationalism and Islamism, Islamic fundamentalism. It calls for nothing less than the destruction of Israel. It is anti-Semitic in substance and in tone. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, of course, a deeply anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-Western movement, and sort of married with the hyper-nationalist sort of ideology of some of the other movements, the PLO, the Fatah faction, others that have waged terrorist campaigns against Israel. You get a sense that this is a truly dangerous ideology. I think that over the years, we have seen, because of the plight of the Gaza people, you got to remember that during the second Intifada, the war of 2000 to 2005, as suicide bombers were streaming into Israel and detonating themselves in restaurants and in shopping malls and buses, the Israelis decided to erect a barrier. And that barrier has been in place since roughly 2005. It was completed right around then. And it is really not allowed for the freedom of movement for the people of Gaza. Then you had the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip. This was a civil war that occurred in 2007. And ever since then, the people of Gaza, roughly 2 million people, have been suffering. They have not a lot of freedom of movement because of the barrier that Israel created for defensive reasons. And then on top of that, they are ruled by something akin to the Taliban, just to be very clear about what's going on here. And so that has, I think, elicited a certain amount of sympathy from elements within the international community. But by the way, elements within the US Congress, for that matter, right? I mean, we see the Squad and Bernie Sanders and others expressing sympathy for Hamas here, or for the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. And I think people like to conflate the people of Gaza with Hamas. And you got to remember that Hamas is an Iran-backed terrorist organization that has horrific sort of attacks and bloodshed on their record. And the people of Gaza, it's a mixed bag. There are, of course, thousands of people that support the Hamas movement, and then there are tens of thousands of people that probably just wanted to get on with their lives and would like nothing more than for all of this to go away. And so this explains some of the kind of mixed bag that we see out there of the support or the abhorrence that has been expressed vis-a-vis Hamas. What's amazing, though, is that, we still see some voices out there. I mean, I saw a statement from Venezuela earlier today, not that we should expect anything different here, but expressing solidarity with Hamas and the government inside the Gaza Strip. These are the sorts of things that, you watch with disbelief.
And then how do we get Hamas out of there? I mean, in other words, can they even vote them out? Chairman Mao said political power grows from the barrel of a gun. I mean, so yeah. Is that not the case of what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is a territory that Israel would not like to reconquer. It may be that Israel has to, and we can talk about what comes next. But the idea that Israel would go in and take over the Gaza Strip again is not very palatable to the IDF. It's not very palatable to the Israeli people. I mean, this is, again, 2 million people in an area roughly the size of Washington, D.C., one of the most densely populated places on Earth by all accounts. Nobody really wants this. It's hostile. There's not a lot of resources there. There's no reason that Israel should want to take this over. The problem is that there's a government there, a terrorist organization that also governs the Gaza Strip, that seeks Israel's destruction. What I think is interesting now, and this is, I think, the game changer from the perspective of Israeli defense officials and others, is that up until now, Israel has been seen as a tactical threat. In other words, they could fire crude rockets. They could, engage in one-off attacks. They could try to, send drones into Israel. They could try to dig tunnels. But there was never a severe threat posed to Israel's existence, because it always was seen as kind of a ragtag organization. Now they have been able to demonstrate that they have competencies that Israel has never seen before. And again, I look there to the hand of Iran. There is no question in my mind that Iran has provided a lot of the technological, the weaponry, and the military support that was needed. in order to conduct these attacks yesterday, this coordinated attack. And so now I think there has to be an open question. And we've seen this now percolate within the Israeli media. Bibi has raised the specter of this, that we could now see a desire on the part of Israel to oust Hamas. This would necessarily involve urban warfare, house-to-house combat, underground warfare, probably a brutal air campaign. These are the sorts of things that I think Israel would probably not like to engage in here. But then I think there's one other question, and again, we can get into what all this looks like. But if Israel really decides to allocate significant resources to toppling Hamas and, let's say regaining a number of the hostages that are being held there, when you allocate the resources that are necessary for something like that, does that leave the rest of the country exposed, right, to Hezbollah, to chaos in the West Bank, to attacks from Iran itself or from proxies in Syria? These are the sorts of tough questions, I think, that Israel has to wrestle with right now, because there is a bigger, larger, much more expansive strategy that I believe Iran is pursuing right now, and Israel must be cognizant of that before it takes any next steps.
Jonathan, speaking of next steps, before we talk about some next steps and some things that you're actually watching out for, I wanted to ask you about the hostages that were taken that we understand are in tunnels right now. How does Israel navigate that? How do they get them back safely? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, we have heard reports that all of the hostages, or many of the hostages, have been brought underground where the rocket stores have been placed. So in other words, with the places that Israel would typically target from the air, they now may be off limits. And I think Israel is working to verify that, but I think we have to assume that this is. I mean, they're basically the Hamas is using human shields to protect their arsenal. Now, human shields is of course a war crime. The U.S. has designated it so. So is the UN. So is NATO. It's common knowledge at this point that you don't put civilians in places where you're trying to preserve your army or your military infrastructure. This is just a horrific practice, but it will potentially constrain Israel's freedom of action inside the Gaza Strip, and it's going to be one of the things that Israel has to contend with here as it plots its course. In terms of next steps inside the Gaza Strip, I think for sure the Israelis would be very content to only strike from the air. And not put boots on the ground. And I should note here that Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, is often characterized as being a war hawk and someone who is, who welcomes conflict. He's actually a very cautious person as it relates to military engagement. You don't see him inserting the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, into potential quagmires. He is he's a historian at the end of the day, and he knows the wars that have ultimately brought down powerful prime ministers in Israel's history. He does not want to allow that to happen to himself, but he is going to feel the pressure right now to do that. And then there is the big question of, if you don't think that Hamas knew that when it conducted these attacks and it crossed over into Israeli airspace, into Israeli territory, and brought back civilians, and is using them as hostages, if you don't think that Hamas knew that it was daring Israel to cross over into the Gaza Strip and for the IDF to wage a ground war, this is undeniably what Hamas is daring Israel to do. And now the question is, what awaits if and when Israel decides to do that? And Bibi must be aware of the risks.
Yeah, and I want to ask you now as we begin to wind down our conversation, but I just have to weigh in with something real quickly, because when you invoke the Hamas charter, I think this is a coming attraction when people talk about free Palestine, free Gaza, etc. This is what they're going to get. really, at the end of the day. So again, encouraging everyone, check out the Hamas charter, because that's what it means when we're talking about freeing Gaza and freeing Palestine. That's what's going to happen. And again, they're shouting from the river to the sea. Well, we know what river and we know what sea, and they want the whole shooting match. They don't just want Gaza in the West Bank. And I think that needs to be underscored indeed. So Jonathan, what are you watching out for as this all unfolds right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm looking at the potential for a multi-front conflict, and it should, of course, be noted that we're having this conversation, on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. This is the last time that Israel found itself drawn into a multi-front conflict, which was, of course, a scarring and devastating event in Israeli history. There's been a lot of talk in recent weeks and even months about how to commemorate, how to understand, how to look back at history, and to understand exactly what happened during the 1973 war, where Israel almost lost. Now, Iran, I think, has designs to try to replicate the Yom Kippur War on some level. That ring of fire strategy that we talked about, right? We're looking at multiple fronts. And the question that I have, and I think many of us, observers of the region, are just wondering, at what point does Iran seek to activate other fronts and to make things even more chaotic? You can imagine the chaos that Israel was dealing with yesterday. That could just be a glimpse of what Israel could be dealing with should Iran choose to animate some of its other proxies. And so, could we see additional chaos in the West Bank, where various terrorist organizations begin to attack Jewish citizens, Israeli citizens that are living in the settlements, forcing the IDF to split itself between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, right, dividing Israel's forces. And then don't forget, in the north, you've got Lebanon, where Hezbollah is entrenched. They've got 150 to 180,000 rockets. That's roughly 10 times the rocket stores that Hamas has. They can saturate Israel with rockets. They have also tunnels that they are able to use to cross the border. They have already tested Israel in terms of crossing the blue line. Israel has actually had a couple of small skirmishes already. Reports indicate that the Israelis shot down an aircraft over Lebanon just on Sunday morning. They also have targeted some small infrastructure, nothing significant, but there have been small skirmishes reported in Lebanon. I think the Hezbollah, which is Iran's strongest proxy group in the Middle East, they are clearly wondering whether this is the moment. We got to remember, all of these groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, they are all in existence for one reason and one reason only, and that is to pursue the destruction of Israel. That's why they were created. They're not there for anything else. And so the question is, does Iran see this as their moment? And then one last wrinkle to this is, should the war in Gaza expand, should other fronts turn hot, and all eyes will be on that ring of fire surrounding Israel, is this the moment that Iran decides to make a dash for a nuclear weapon? Right? I mean, there is a broader picture here of what Iran has been building toward. And these, we tend to, I think, in the United States in particular, the Jewish community, the pro-Israel community, we look at Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad as threats unto themselves. And I think it's a mistake. Yes, you can analyze each one of these groups as as threats unto themselves, but they are part of a patchwork. They are part of a network that Iran created in pursuit of a broader strategy, which is the destruction of the Jewish state. And this is what I'm watching for, is signs that this could be Iran's moment. We have to hope, of course, that that is not the case, that all the other fronts stay quiet, and that Israel can right the ship along its southern border, dispatch with Hamas, and do what it must. But it cannot be ignored that Israel needs to be extremely vigilant right now on these other fronts. There is nothing that says that Hamas has to hold these other fronts back.
And Jonathan, really, as we wind down our conversation, because I'm super mindful of your time and the clock, um, just the international response to this. Um, because we've looked at a list of countries that are in support of Israel. We've looked at a list of countries that are not in support, some that have just gone silent, et cetera. Do you think that this will change public opinion about what Iran is really all about and what Iran's intentions are? And will there be any effect there?
Look, I think right now Israel has public support. It was clearly, there's one aggressor in this situation. And I think that's positive. And by the way, we've seen wonderful statements coming out of the White House, and this Secretary of Defense and members of Congress largely have been in support of Israel. But, don't forget that as Israel's counteroffensive takes shape and strikes occur with frequency inside the Gaza Strip, and casualties, as they always will, mount, and as the videos and images of destruction become more commonplace, destruction of the Gaza Strip, there will be calls from the UN. There will be calls from, progressive groups in the United States, and certainly in Europe, where they're going to say, well, look, there's only one solution to this, and it's diplomatic, and everybody needs to get back to the negotiating table. And the Israelis are going to say, there is no negotiating with Hamas at this point, and there is no negotiating with Iran. It would be wonderful if somebody could broker the return of these hostages, and perhaps start some kind of diplomatic process with Israel and the Iranian axis. But I don't see the Iranian axis being willing to do this. And we've actually seen statements, again, as of Sunday morning. Salah Haruri, one of the key military leaders of Hamas, came out and said that, first of all, he wants to use the 170 something hostages to return thousands of convicted Hamas prisoners and, people that have been convicted of terrorist attacks inside of Israel. So he wants to use civilians in order to trade for prisoners who should be, by all rights, sitting in Israeli jails for 10, 20 years, life sentences, etc. So he wants to do that. But he also noted that he plans to widen the front with Israel. He wants to widen the war. So the idea that Israel should show restraint or proportional force, we hear that a lot, that Israel's disproportionate response to attacks like these, I expect the excoriation to begin at some point as Israel's counterattack mounts. But I think from Israel's perspective, and the people of Israel are looking right now to the IDF. They are looking right now to the Israeli intelligence system and to the broader security architecture that Israel has created. They are looking for balance. They are looking for a return of Israel's primacy militarily, intelligence, otherwise. So the IDF has a lot to prove right now. There'll be a lot of pressure on this government right now, but I think the thing that I watch for is overreaction on the part of Israel, where they leave certain flanks open or they allow for the Iranian axis to exploit weaknesses.
And really now, just final question before we push off. We have a very international audience, Jonathan. We have listeners in countries with which Israel doesn't even have diplomatic ties. Indonesia, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Lebanon, you name it. And we have downloads from those countries. Is there a particular message that you would like to share with citizens of those countries?
Yeah, look, Iran is one of the revisionist powers of the world. We look at really three of them right now that would look to overturn the world order as it stands right now. We look at Russia, China, and Iran. They are the big three. And what they're looking for is to erode the rules-based order that the United States established in the immediate aftermath of World War II. This order has, I think, served humanity remarkably well. It doesn't. This is not to say that things have been perfect under the U.S.-led world order, but if you look across the board at the advances made on the part of humanity, technologically, food security, medicine, et cetera, I mean, it's a remarkable achievement. And when I look at what Iran seeks to do, it's not just to destroy Israel, right? I mean, the ideology of this regime is about destroying the United States and the Western-led world order, aligning themselves with Russia and Iran, Russia and China. We, of course, see what those countries are trying to do or already doing in terms of aggressive actions around the world. And so, for the countries that are fence sitters or, have been traditionally ambivalent, this is not about Israel only, in my view. This is about a broader trend that we're seeing around the world that I think is quite dangerous. And again, this is about the erosion of what has been built, an attempt to, redesign the world's sort of structures that have kept things relatively calm and prosperous for decades now. And so this is, I think, part of the concern. This is not just an attack against Israel. This is an attempt to redraw the map in a broader attempt by multiple countries to redraw the map as well.
Jonathan Schanzer, we want to thank you so much for providing your perspective. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this special episode of IsraelCast, and this is definitely to be continued. We will have you back for more.
Pleasure. Thanks, Stephen.
Well, we'll have info about Jonathan on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, for our regularly scheduled shows, we do release new episodes of IsraelCast every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Simply search for IsraelCast. And of course, don't forget to rate and review us, because that makes it easier for more people around the world to find us. You can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And for the behind the scenes work, we want to thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, JD Krebs, and Ellie Cadrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios, right here in the very heart of New York City. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say hello to any of us here on the program, we'd love to hear from you. Do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning in to this special episode of IsraelCast, and let's all pray for peace.